Okay, good evening again, everyone. Tonight we continue in Mark 26 in the parallel accounts. We previously had covered Jesus being taken from the Garden of Gethsemane and examined by the high priest and the sham trial there. And then as dawn came on the scene, they could move the trial to the Sanhedrin. It was illegal for them to meet during the night, so they did it as soon as there was daylight. The indication is that not everyone was there, so they even rushed that. Later, we know that Gamaliel and Nicodemus and probably others that weren't there, but nonetheless, Christ knew that this would not be done legally and went along with it because of the plan of salvation. So after Jesus was tried and condemned by the Sanhedrin, we pick up the story with Christ being taken to the home of the high priest, Caiaphas. So this is around dawn following what was done at the Sanhedrin. So we're Wednesday morning by our calendar, Abib 14th, which is the daylight portion after the Passover. And the typical home during this time would have a courtyard if it was of any wealth. If you didn't have wealth, we've looked many Bible studies ago at a typical home in Jerusalem. Even if you didn't have a courtyard, the house surrounded, you'd have a courtyard before the house. And generally for a low income or low middle income family, then you'd have stairs that would go up to the top of the building, flat roofs. They didn't have to worry about snow. Rain could run off, gutters off the side. And so a lot of times they would spend time outside during the summer months because it would be much cooler at night outside. In more wealthier homes, you'd have these courtyards. And of course, they would be elaborate. They would have trees for shade, sometimes other things like a fountain. For the high priest, he had a courtyard as well where he would conduct some business, where he would see people, and in this case, the crowd that came to witness what was being done with Jesus Christ. This model here, if you can't read it very well, I apologize, but recently there was a mansion found in what's called the upper city of Jerusalem. If you look at Jerusalem as a roughly shaped sort of oblong circle, the temple typically was sort of center east, center right of a whole city of Jerusalem. The upper city was southwest from the temple, down in that southwest corner of the city. And this is where the high priest's home was. So to pick up the account, we'll read John's account. It's a little more detailed. So this is John 18, verses 15 to 18, and then 27 to 25. John's account doesn't follow the same information as the others. Excuse me. So we have gaps in that are covered in other places. So John 18, verse 15 says, Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another disciple. Now that disciple was known to the high priest and entered in with Jesus into the court of the high priest. So again, the trial, if you will, was moved to the high priest's home, and this crowd came into the courtyard. Now, Peter is directly identified, but oftentimes in John's account, he would speak of himself in the third person, probably because of humility, didn't want to make the story about himself. But it is probably John here that he's referring to himself. So this other this other disciple knew the high priest, and so he was invited directly in. Not everybody could fit in this courtyard. So then outside of whether it was Annas or Caiaphas here, probably Caiaphas's residence, the rest of the crowd would be outside. They could hear some of what was going on. What they couldn't hear, you would have people that would relay the information back to them. So if you remember previously, Christ had told Peter that Peter would deny Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed in the morning. So we're at Wednesday morning, and we're at the high priest's home, and Peter has not yet denied him. So to continue in verse 16 of John 18, it says, but Peter was standing at the door outside. So he wasn't in the home, he was outside in the street. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought in Peter. So this young lady was sort of the doorman, the keeper of the gate. So John, it seems, went out, talked to her, and said, please let my friend come in. Verse 17, and the maid who kept the door said to Peter, are you also one of this man's disciples? We're not given any context as why she asked the question. It may be simply because it was John asking for him to come in as an exception. She put two and two together and asked the question. And so he says, I am not. Now it says, verse 18, the servants and the officers were standing there having made a fire of coals, for it was cold. It was not unusual, even this time of year. Excuse me, Passover typically can fall from late March into middle April on our calendar, depending on the year. And even in Judea, it would be chilly at night till the sun warmed things up. So it was not uncommon to have what's called a brazier. So think of a bowl, it could be varying sizes, but let's just say roughly a foot across in diameter on a stand, and they would put coals, or they would put bramble, or they would put other light, small combustible material in this. And as it had coals, then you would have more warmth, and you could stand around it sort of like we do just in general with a fire, and you could warm your hands and get a little warmth off of it. So this is verse 18. It says they were warming themselves. Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. Now, it seems Peter sort of thought maybe that he could blend in, that who would know who he is. Christ didn't spend a great deal of time in Jerusalem during his ministry. He was out in Judea. He was in other parts of the nation, Samaria, Capernaum, and these various other places. And so maybe Peter thought, well, nobody would know me much, that he can sort of be a fly on the wall and see and hear what's going on, but not really involved. And so verse 25 of John 18, it says, now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they said to him, so the group around this brazier says, you aren't also one of his disciples. Are you asking the question? It says, but he denied it and said, I am not. So we have the first denial here. The other gospel accounts are a little more direct. Mark's account involves more. Mark 14, verse 68 says, but he denied it, saying, I neither know nor understand what you are saying. I don't understand the question, sort of thing, which is not really true, is it? He understood, he didn't want to answer. So it says in Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 68 again, he went out to the porch. So he went out of the courtyard area, and he says, and it says, Mark's account says, the rooster crowed. So Peter hears this. So to continue in Matthew's account then, Matthew 26, sorry, let me scroll down and get to that on the screen so you can see it if you're reading along there. Let's see, that's the next page. I want to come back to something I missed here in a moment. But so Matthew 26 and verse 71, when he had gone out to the porch, someone else saw him and said to those who were there, this man also was with Jesus of Nazareth. Now, was this one of the mob that came out to Gethsemane? Was this someone else just in Jerusalem that saw them leading up to this event? Whatever the case was, he's making a statement here. He's not asking a question. I know, I've seen this man with Jesus. Matthew 26, verse 72, Peter again denied it with an oath. Now, some accounts, I think the King James says he cursed. We'll come to that a little bit later on in some other accounts. But this oath, this matter of an oath, is pretty strong language here. he is swearing. Modern day terms, in courthouse, they don't use a Bible anymore, but they used to. And now you just have to put your hand up, and it's basically your word to swear or to give an oath that you're telling the truth. And so this is a similar thing he's doing here, almost like a legal position. He says, I don't know the man. So again, this is the second denial. He denies Jesus again. To continue in Matthew's account, Matthew 26, verse 73 says, after a little while, those who stood by came and said to Peter. So this is evidently back at the brazier, or maybe just in the crowd standing around. And they said to Peter, surely you are also one of them, for your speech makes you known. Now, this is a curious thing. Mark's account says you're a Galilean. So there must have been enough of an accent for those who were in Galilee, that region around the Sea of Galilee, which Peter was as a fisherman, for those in Jerusalem to hear the difference. That could be the emphasis on different syllables. We do it in English with endings like ing. You can tell certain people are from certain parts of the country, whether they say running or running, or from where I'm from in southwestern Ohio, a creek or a crick. These sort of things, that they pegged him as not being from Jerusalem. And that got his goat, if you will, as well, because in Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 71, it says there he began to curse. Now, this is not curse as in swearing vulgar language. This is a curse as if, rather, as he makes this oath, he's swearing to the veracity of this, and he's putting something binding behind it. That's the meaning of that word. So if this is not true, I pronounce this curse on myself. Think of it that way. And he says to swear. Swearing and the cursing are in the same context. The curse is the consequence. The swearing is the declaration of truth. He says, I don't know this man of whom you speak. And so now we come to the third denial here. And so continuing Mark's account, Mark 14, verse 72, it says, the rooster crowed the second time. Peter remembered the word, how Jesus said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And I can only imagine what was running through Peter's mind. It didn't seem to connect the first 2 times he denied. And this is the power of self-denial, isn't it? Maybe he thought he was stronger. Maybe he thought, or just wasn't thinking about it at all. Didn't connect the 2, certainly, but the third time it clicked. When he heard that rooster, that second crow, he remembered. And so then let's go to Luke's account. Luke 22 and verse 61. It says, the Lord turned and looked at Peter. That's all he did. This is across the courtyard. If he had spoken, Peter probably wouldn't have heard him anyway. There was a crowd there. There was other hubbub going on. But Christ, on hearing that rooster, simply looked across and saw Peter. They connected eyes, and that was all that needed to be done. And it says, Peter remembered the Lord's word, how he said, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. And then verse 62, he went out and wept bitterly. The realization that he denied Christ in his presence. He thought he was stronger than that. He thought he had more fortitude. He would be the one, as he said, I will not deny you. I'll stand there with you, whatever it was he ended up saying. And Christ knew simply at that point in Peter's life, he didn't have it in him, without God's Spirit especially. Now, Peter was very jump before you look sort of thing, leap before you look, which is not the right way to do it, is it? You should count the cost and all these things. But Peter was very energetic and gung-ho, and God later used that trait, tempered with his spirit, to great effectiveness. But Peter wasn't there yet, and he realized that. and he didn't like it. He didn't like that he had let Christ down. He didn't like that he saw in him this weakness, this spiritual weakness, and it overwhelmed him emotionally because he had probably the thoughts along the line of letting down the best person in his life. He had been with Christ for 3.5 years. He had seen the miracles. He had heard the preaching. He had witnessed what Christ had done all that time. He was committed to being a part of it and one of the faithful disciples. And yet, at this moment, none of that mattered because he had let Christ down. Not that doing anything any differently would have changed any outcome. That's not what we're referring to. But any of us that have let down a friend, you know the emotional disappointment we have in that because this person trusted us, they depended on us, whatever it was, and we let them down. And this is where Peter is. So to go back to the thought that I missed, I guess that was it. Something passed my mind earlier, but I guess we had already covered it. All right, so this is again at Caiaphas's house in the courtyard, and all of this takes place sort of as a backstory as to what's happening with Christ. So then we come next to the conversation moving back to the Sanhedrin, or moving to the Sanhedrin. Now, if you can picture in your mind the city map, well, let me just scroll back up and show you this map, even if you can't see it very well. This red outline is the outer wall, the new wall. The black lines were the old city. So on the center right here is the temple complex, the temple itself, and then this area is the temple complex. On this south edge of the temple complex was what was called the royal palace or royal porches. That long building there, and it was multi-storied, was where the Sanhedrin met, and one end of it. And so this is where this has moved. So Herod's palace is over here on the very outside, and the high priest's home is down here. So it moves across the city back to the Sanhedrin. So that's the context of this next section. So as I mentioned, they could only meet during the day to do their business. So evidently now it's shortly after dawn, sun has come up, because it says in Matthew 27:1, when morning had come. So it's interesting to note in this account, this section here, how much of what the Sanhedrin did was illegal. They, to use our terms, they trampled on Christ's rights again and again and again. One of which was the previous things were done during the night. So that was one illegal aspect. The other is, of course, false witnesses. And they knew they were false witnesses because their stories didn't even match each other. But also, Christ was not able to call his own witnesses. And it was a day before a holy day. All of those things were illegal. Because if you're going to accuse someone of something major, especially, they had the right to call their own witnesses. Even in the Old Testament, God said that you don't even consider a matter unless you have 2 or 3 witnesses. But that's not total. That's like what we would say for the defense and for the prosecution, each side. Christ didn't get to call anyone to defend him. They twisted his words to create false witnesses, and then they also did it at night. And this goes back to the aspect of witnesses, calling witnesses. There was no time even. If they had done it during the day, there still would have been multiple days to allow these people to travel to Jerusalem, to meet before the Sanhedrin, to give their account, to answer questions, all of these things. So this was very much rushed. And the term we use, don't use it so much now, but back in the 50s and 60s and so, we would call this a kangaroo court, where it was obviously shoddy, legally very loose, if that, and it was rushed to a foregone conclusion. So the Sanhedrin, again, the room was shaped like a horseshoe, and various individuals would stand on the open end or towards the top of the circle part of the horseshoe. And the Sanhedrin was 72 men made up of the high priests and scribes, and the indication is also some Pharisees. This was the governing body for Judea under the Roman authority. The Sanhedrin was given the latitude to take care of the religious matters of the land. So they're approaching this initially from a religious perspective. They don't like what Christ is teaching. They don't like the implications of what he's teaching. They don't like the fact that he's been very clear that they're not doing the right thing, tossing the animals and the money changers out of the temple complex. This was their side hustle. This is how they made money. They weren't supposed to make money. They were supposed to collect the tithes from the priests who collected the tithes from the people. To go back to the Old Testament account of how that worked. They were not to own land. They were not to have anything outside the city. They were to be taken care of by the people. But it had changed by this time, and the Romans, especially as they got involved, they very much politicized this position to control the people. So they're at the Sanhedrin, and Mark's account, just to highlight Mark 15, verse 1, Mark again uses this word immediately. Mark was always sort of, everything was happening quick. Mark's account is much shorter because he's focusing on the action of things. And so let's read Luke's account because it is the most detail in this section. Luke 22, beginning in verse 66, says, as soon as it was day, the assembly of the elders of the people were gathered together, both chief priests and scribes, and they led him away to their council. So they're coming from Caiaphas's home, walking across the city, taking Christ bound to go before the Sanhedrin. So they're in the assembly now, verse 67. If you are the Christ, tell us. If you are the Messiah. Now they knew from Daniel's record, when to expect Christ. And you can even read in Acts of a couple of individuals who claimed to be the Messiah and who were not. And even Gamaliel says in Acts, if this is of God, we can't stop it. If it is, we don't want to try. So they weren't even entertaining that. But they're questioning him here. So this is a command, tell us. But he said to them, if I tell you, you won't believe. I mean, he knows this is just for show here. He says, and if I ask, you will in no way answer me or let me go. So basically, and if I try to defend myself, you're not going to let me go. So verse 69, from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Meaning, all of this is going to go according to what God has predetermined, prophecy, his plan of salvation, and I'll go back in my glorified form to be seated next to the Father. So they don't like that statement. Verse 70, it says, then they all said, all of them, it's like they heard that, and they all rise up in unison and say, are you then the Son of God? They had even missed the connection in the Old Testament. They had lost so much spiritual understanding that they weren't even thinking about all the prophecies in the Old Testament. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of prophecies in the Old Testament talking about this very thing. That they had just so disconnected themselves, they couldn't fathom God coming down as man, and that they had become so monotheistic that there could be anyone other than, as we know, the Father. They simply said God. And so they asked the question, verse 70, and then he says to them, you say it because I am. No brag, just fact. That was the old Western, I think, in the early 70s. He says, I'm not lying because it is true. So verse 71, Luke 22. They said then, in response to his statement, why do we need any more witness? For we ourselves have heard from his own mouth. Now, I mentioned that he didn't have any witnesses there. They wouldn't even let him testify in his own defense. But in their mind, they now had the charge, and the charge is blasphemy. Christ is making it very clear here. Jesus is making it very clear. He's not denying. They ask the question, are you the Son of God? And he basically says, yes. And they said, well, we don't even need to go any further in this trial. We've got it, his own words here. But if they wanted him dead, blasphemy is not the charge they end up following up on. We'll see that as we progress here. Because the Romans, again, didn't care about the internal religious debate. All they cared about was collecting taxes and if the people were at peace, so they wouldn't rise up in rebellion. That was the job of the governor. We'll see this in Pilate as we progress as well. Pilate was a very weak leader. He didn't stand up to the people. There were times that he tweaked them unnecessarily. But this is what they're settled on now. So for now, this concludes. And then we have another inset here. We pick up the account going back to Judas at the beginning of the evening after Passover. If you remember, during Passover, Christ told him, go and do what you're going to do quickly. So he went, found the high priest. They brought their soldiers, the temple guard, if you will. They also brought, it seems, Roman authorities with them. And this crowd, this mob that followed them out, Judas kissed Christ, signifying who it was, which is very interesting. After all these years, they needed something like that to confirm that he was the Messiah. It goes back to just how common Christ looked. All the pictures show him as this fair-skinned, thin-faced, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, long-haired Jesus. He didn't have a Semitic look in his genetic body, according to the paintings and the illustrations and sculptures and such. He probably was like 5'8" to 5'10", dark black hair, probably a brownish complexion, of average look, probably wasn't ugly, probably wasn't handsome as we would describe it, probably muscular from all the years doing, it was called carpentry, but it involved a lot of stonemasonry as well. So probably very fit, but he just blended, this is why he blended into the crowd so many times, it just disappeared. So Judas had to identify him. And so now we've got the story of Judas, because we haven't heard anything about him since that part at the beginning of the evening or the night. So Matthew's account is the only of the gospel accounts, and then we have a connection in Acts. So let's read Matthew 27, verse 3. It says, then Judas, who betrayed him, Christ, when he saw that Jesus was condemned, so evidently he followed the crowd as well. He saw what was probably done at the high priest's home. He certainly saw what was done at the Sanhedrin hall, because he knows that Christ is condemned. He felt remorse, and that's an understatement, as we'll see. It seems that Judas thought something else would happen, that the high priest, the Sanhedrin, would do something else, not seek to kill Christ. He never made that connection in his mind. We don't know what he thought they would do. I've heard some speculate that maybe Judas thought that Christ wasn't doing enough, that as many thought the Messiah was supposed to restore the sovereignty of the nation, restore them to the glory of David. We have hints of that in the prophecies, but we, of course, know that's millennial and then on. He didn't come to establish the kingdom. He came to preach the kingdom and to pay the price as our sacrifice so that we can be in that kingdom. Judas didn't understand any of that. Maybe as a zealot, he thought that Christ needed to be doing more to correct the Roman oversight and so forth. We don't know. Whatever he thought was going to happen was not what happened. And so if you remember the account as well, the high priest paid him 30 pieces of silver to betray Christ, to deliver Christ into their hands. And so after this remorse comes upon him, he knows this is going sideways. He can't do one thing to change now the outcome he sees happening. So he brings the silver back to the chief priests and the elders. And this shows you how twisted up their thinking was. They knew they could not directly work out the killing of Christ, and yet they're doing that. They wanted plausible deniability. Well, we only paid you money. We didn't pay you money to get the Romans to kill you. Whatever their thoughts were. In their minds, their hands are clean. They knew what this money purchased. So he brings it back. Verse 4, he says, I've sinned in that I've betrayed innocent blood. He knew Christ did nothing worthy of being condemned to death. And then notice what they said. What is that to us? You see to it, meaning the money. Whatever you want to do with the money, that's on you now. It was called blood money because Judas knew it was Jesus Christ was innocent of it, and it was going to cost Christ his life, his blood. So going back to verse 3, the 30 pieces of silver is a very interesting amount. You can look at it two different ways. It was the price of an injured slave in the Old Testament. If you go back to Exodus 21, verse 32, if you owned a slave and it was injured in service to you. Now, a slave, don't think of a slave strictly as we understand the historical context. Think of them more as indentured servants. But after having paid their debts, if they wanted to stay in the master's house, then as it says, an awl would be driven through their ear. Most people miss that symbology in the modern context. An earring denotes that someone owns you. And so then this indentured servant, if they were injured in whatever way, damaged their ability to now serve at their full physical potential, they were to be paid 30 pieces of silver. During this time, this first century time period, it was about a half a year's salary, so not a small amount. So let's just pick a number and say 50,000. Last time I looked, it was high 40s was average salary, median in this country. So let's just round it up and say 50,000. You're looking at $25,000 to betray Christ. Not a small amount of money. So verse 4, they said, it's not our problem. Verse 5, so he threw down the pieces of silver in the sanctuary. So he went across the temple complex. Again, the Sanhedrin Hall was on the south edge. The temple, think of the temple in the middle of this long rectangle, this tall rectangle. He goes to the temple. He goes to the altar. He doesn't go in the temple, but he throws the money in the temple. It's probably in some sort of leather bag. And he says he left. And after he left, verse 5, he went away and he hung himself. So again, it's very interesting that they paid Judas to falsely accuse Christ. They used that to trump up these other charges. But after all that was done, they claimed they couldn't keep the money. Verse 6, the chief priests took the pieces of silver and said it's not lawful to put them into the treasury. It's just astounding how much they justify themselves here. And notice what they say, since it is the price of blood. Well, who paid Judas to make it the price of blood? They did. So they talked amongst themselves. Okay, so since we can't put it in the treasury, what do we do with it? And they took counsel and they bought a potter's field with it to bury strangers in. Now, in this time, it seems that there was a potter's field near the city. It was called a potter's field because it was probably a good source of clay that the potters would come to dig the clay to use to make their vessels. Well, as they dug for the clay, it seemed that they would leave these indentations in the ground. And so oftentimes, as some theologians and historians talk about, they would use those divots, those holes in the ground, to bury people that, as we would say, were indigent. They didn't have family to claim the body, or the family had so little money they couldn't afford to pay. And so they would bury them in this field, this area. So, as it says, that to bury strangers in. Verse 8 then, therefore that field is called the field of blood. So it's no longer the potter's field, it's now the field of blood, because the field was bought with blood money. Verse 9, then that which was spoken of through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him upon whom a price had been said, whom some of the children of Israel priced, and they gave them for a potter's field as the Lord commanded. Now, I have the cue there. I didn't send out the questions, but the question here is, how do we reconcile these references, because it says Jeremiah, but if you go to the book of Jeremiah, you will not find these things mentioned. It's actually in Zechariah 11, verse 13. Now, Jeremiah seems to allude to them in a couple of places. And so some have said, well, Jeremiah was being loosely paraphrased here. Or in some cases, even we probably each of us have done this, where you quote something thinking it was from one source and it was actually from another. Doesn't mean the quote is wrong, just that we misremembered. Another way of looking at it, some have said, is that in the Jewish canon of what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish canon of the Hebrew Scriptures, Jeremiah was the first of the prophetic books. So of that section, sometimes they say the expression would be Jeremiah says, meaning not Jeremiah specifically, but Jeremiah as the first of the prophets recorded in that section. His name took on a representation of all those prophets. So there are several ways that you can look at this, but nonetheless, it is from Zechariah. So Judas killed himself. Now in Acts 1, the beginning of Acts there, we have the account of what happened afterwards. And so that's why this account is here. So Acts 1, verse 18, it says, now this man obtained a field with the reward for his wickedness, meaning Judas obtained it. He was dead, but through the money that he was given, it was obtained because of his wickedness. Now, whether or not he understood what the Sanhedrin was ultimately going to do didn't matter. He betrayed Christ for the purpose of allowing them to punish him on whatever level. Verse 19, then, it became known to everyone who lived in Jerusalem that their language, this field was called Al-Qadama, or that is the field of blood. And so that's the account, the backstory, while all this is happening after the Sanhedrin condemned him. So then we move next to the account of Christ being brought before Pilate. So we're still in the very early morning portion of the day. So in Jerusalem, you have pretty even daylight, nighttime portions, roughly 12 hours each. And with that being the case, then sunrise is probably around 6:30. So this is probably somewhere around 7:30, 8 o'clock, somewhere in there. It's still very early in the morning. So John's account has the most detail here, but again, to highlight Mark 15, verse 1, he uses immediately again. Immediately in the morning. Everything is right away. Mark is very action-oriented. But in John 18, verse 28, we have John's account of what happens next as Christ is brought before Pilate. Now, Pilate didn't have a house in Jerusalem. But as we read in John's account here, John 18, verse 28 says, they led Jesus, therefore, from Caiaphas into the praetorium. Now, the praetorium is a catch-all phrase. In the Roman military culture, the general would have a tent that would be the praetorium, and the praetorium would be used for treaty negotiations, surrenders of the generals of the opposing parties. If someone of higher rank came out to view the armies, this was sort of the meeting tent. And as time progressed, it evolved, if you will, from simply a tent representing the high-ranking official to now oftentimes being the home of the governor of a region. Now, in this region, the governor is Pilate, but Pilate lived in Caesarea, not in Jerusalem. So when he came to Jerusalem, he used Herod's home. But don't think of it as just a simple complex. As if you can see this model down here, this is Herod's palace. And if you can see up here, this is the western wall of the temple. This is the Antonian fortress here. This is the backside of the temple up here. So it's just across the way. Probably just a couple tenths of a mile, if that, probably only a tenth of a mile. So Herod would live in one end, and the other end would be the courtyard. That's not the right expression, but the building that would be used for these public meetings. And when Pilate came to town, this would become the praetorium. And so this is where they are, as John says. They came to the praetorium. It was easy, and they themselves didn't enter into the praetorium that they might not be defiled. That is, those who led Jesus here. Now, there are a couple of reasons why they would not enter. One is entering any Gentile residence would defile them because the Gentiles were unclean. And if you went, you could go in, but after you came out, you would be ceremonially unclean. You have to go through the whole process of becoming clean. You'd be separated from the congregation, the whole thing, just like it's described in the Old Testament. They misinterpreted and used in this fashion. They didn't want to do that because, as it says there in verse 28 there, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. That is, if they don't become defiled, they can still keep the Passover. If not, they would have had to have done it a month later. So this is the high priest. This is the members of the Sanhedrin, the scribes and so forth. And this is how, on one hand, zealous they are, but on the other hand, how much they miss. They'll keep this sort of detail, but then they'll justify paying somebody to falsely accuse somebody and then saying, well, we can't accept that money back because it was used for innocent blood. So this is just this passive aggressive back and forth that they maneuver in their minds over. So let me just make sure I haven't missed anything here for the praetorium. Okay, so they're at this building. And so verse 29, John 18, Pilate therefore went out to them. So they're outside of the building, which they could be. They're not in a residence. So if it was outside and this is the location, there's a big courtyard here. So they could all be gathered in the courtyard. They're not in a residence. This is not enclosed. So Pilate goes out to them. Whether he knew their customs or whether he was reminded of it, he came out to them. And so then in verse 29, he says to them, what accusation do you bring against this man? Now, again, the governor, which is Pilate, part of his task was also to determine capital cases. So he was to make sure the taxes got collected, that the land was at peace, the Roman armies didn't have to come in and put a rebellion down. That was huge. But in this case also, he was the only one who could determine if someone was to be put to death. He was the final say in this matter. So since they're before him, this is the question on his mind. What accusation do you bring against this man? So let's hear the case. So verse 30, they answered him, if this man weren't an evildoer, we wouldn't have delivered him up to you. So they front load the conversation. They haven't even said what he's done, supposedly. They said, well, we're here because this man's an evildoer. In Luke's account, Luke 23, verse 2, it says they began to accuse him. We found this man perverting the nation. Okay, well, that's a pretty broad statement. So they elaborate. Notice what they say here. Forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Okay, that's a big one. And saying that he himself is Christ, a king. Okay, so now we have avoidance of paying taxes and claiming to be a king. And the inference is that they were going to, Christ was fomenting rebellion against Caesar. Those are two huge things, either one of which Christ could be put to death for if they were true. So what you notice is when Christ was before the Sanhedrin, at the conclusion of the matter, they said, well, he's claiming to be God, and this is blasphemy. They never bring blasphemy up before Pilate here, because Pilate doesn't care. He doesn't care about the Jewish gods, Jewish religion, their traditions, whatever. He just doesn't care. He wouldn't have heard the matter. So now they've switched the charge back to from blasphemy to treason and rebellion. So going back to John's account, John 18, verse 31. So he says to them, he's not a stupid man. He's just a weak leader. He's sensing here, there's more going on here. They're playing something. And so he says to them, take him to yourselves, go hear the matter before yourself and judge him according to your law. Because Pilate has heard nothing about any of this. If you've got someone that wants to stir up the nation and to hit Caesar in the pocketbook by stop paying taxes, and you're going to foment a rebellion, I'm the Messiah, and try to rally the nation around him to throw off Roman rule, that's not going to be kept secret. You're going to hear bits and pieces of this. You're going to begin to start seeing these things play out in different areas of the nation. Different names keep coming up, and we'll see that Christ's name was known, but Pilate never paid attention to him because he didn't have a reason to. So he says, look, go judge this matter yourself. Therefore, the Jews said to him, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. And there is the nut of the matter. This is why they had to go from blasphemy to forbidding taxes and to fomenting rebellion, because that would make it Pilate's job and he could put Christ to death. They were forbidden to do this, to make capital punishment part of their punishment. So what they're saying here is, doesn't really matter what the charge is as long as you see to his death. So verse 32, it continues the thought John does after saying it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death, that the words of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying what kind of death he should die. Because the Roman form of capital punishment was crucifixion. And Christ talked earlier, a couple of places, about being raised up. And that's how it was done. Most of the illustrations are wrong, though, because they have the person being crucified very high up on this stake. Bear in mind, most of the male population wasn't even 6 foot. 5'8", 5'9", 5'10". Height is a more modern phenomenon across, a nation. And so first of all, they're not very tall. And to crucify someone, they're not at the very top of the post, but you'd have a little bit of height above them, depending on if it was simply a pole and their hands were above their head nailed on, or whether there was a crossbeam. So the post only had to be about 7.5, 8 feet out of the ground. And this is not a permanent thing. You don't have to worry about a frost line in Judea, so you're not going down 3 feet. So the post only had to be in the ground 1.5 feet, 2 feet. And sometimes not even that much. They would jam rocks in around it because it didn't have to last very long, until the person was dead. And then when they would take that crucifix down, they would give the body to whoever, and that would be it. So it's not a very tall thing. But this is what they wanted. They wanted him crucified. They wanted him put to death. And this is what Christ referred to. So then, continuing, John's account says, Pilate therefore entered again to the praetorium. So Christ is in the building. He had been taken before Pilate. Pilate went out to talk to the Sanhedrin, the high priest, and so forth. He gets these answers. He goes back in now to talk to Jesus. I mean, Pilate's at least doing his due diligence here. He ends up caving, as we know, and we'll see. But at least he's doing more of what he's supposed to do than the Sanhedrin was doing, so that he goes back. Okay, they made the accusation that Christ is declaring himself a king. So he goes back in verse 33. He enters the praetorium, says to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? This is what they're saying. Do you claim this? Christ answered him, verse 34. Do you say this by yourself, or did others tell you about me? So he's asking, how do you come by this? Now, in the other gospel accounts, they all say or record Pilate asking the question, are you the king of the Jews? And he simply says, so you say, which is neither affirming or denying. But in John's account, he seems to go further. So they're not mutually exclusive here. He could say, so you say. Then he could also go on to say, do you say this by yourself, or did others tell you? See, John could have been there in person because he was in the courtyard of Caiaphas's house, right? And it wouldn't make any difference to John going into Praetorium because he had already kept the Passover. The Passover the high priest, the Sanhedrin, are going to keep was at the end of the 5th, into the 14th, not the beginning of the 14th, which is what the Jews do to this day. They had switched that. In Christ's time, there were still 2 Passovers, if you will. But shortly after the destruction of the temple, it became the only way to do Passover was at the end of the 14th. And there's a greater discussion there as to why that's incorrect. They should know better. It's very clear in the Old Testament. So anyway, Christ is in the Praetorium. Pilate asks him this question. Jesus responds. Verse 35, Pilate then answers Christ's statement. He says, I'm not a Jew, am I? See, Pilate still understands this is a religious dispute here. This is not a civil matter. He's trying to untangle this enough to understand what's going on and to help him make a decision. So he says, your own nation and the chief priest delivered you to me. What have you done? There must be a reason they did this. What was the reason? And it says here, Christ answered, verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. Now, he's not directly answering, yes, I'm a king, no, I'm not a king. He simply explains. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight that I wouldn't be delivered to the Jews. My supporters would rise up and they would stop this nonsense. He says, but now my kingdom is not from here. My kingdom is not yet here. Okay, well, from Pilate's perspective, Christ is a non-issue, isn't he? It's a non-starter. He's not a threat to Pilate, to the Caesar, to the Roman Empire at all. So, to continue in John's account, let me scroll down. To continue, John 18, verse 37, Pilate then says to him, are you a king then? He still comes back to that because Christ didn't directly answer it. And Christ answered, you say that I am a king. For this reason I have been born, and for this reason I have come into the world, that I should testify to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. So then Pilate gives a response in the infamous, if you will, statement, what is truth? You can read this a number of ways. Some, probably many people, read this as sort of snarky. I read it as someone who's tired. Because if you want political intrigue, the Roman Empire, especially in the governmental circles, especially as somebody as high up as Pilate was, you knew political intrigue, and truth was fluid. He can see it even with the Jewish authorities. The truth, even that they professed, was fluid, wasn't it? So he asks here, what is truth? I sort of see Pilate shrugging his shoulders when he does this. So wasn't really a question, it was rhetorical. So after Pilate said this, he went out again to the Jews and said, so he's outside of the building, the Praetorium, he's now facing them in whatever courtyard. He says to them simply, I find no basis for a charge against him. You haven't made a case. He's no threat to the Roman Empire. And so consequently, this is not a political issue. It's not a civil matter. This is a religious matter. Your problem, he's trying to tell them. So let's go to Matthew's account, Matthew 27, verse 12. It says, when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. So they followed up with Pilate. Okay, again, Pilate basically says, you haven't made your case. So they double down on the accusations. And they're not just accusations against Christ. They're trying to make accusations that Pilate has to act on. Because unless Pilate acts, they can't have Christ put to death. But Christ isn't playing that game with him. He just stays silent because it's not going to change anything. They're going to twist what he says. They're going to make arguments against it. They're going to talk about things he's not talking about. You know, all of this, and there's just no point in engaging. So verse 13, Matthew 27. Pilate then says to him, Pilate's watched this go back and forth. So he speaks again to Christ. Don't you hear how many things they testify against you? Basically, why aren't you answering? They didn't even give Pilate an answer now. He gave him no answer, not even one word. So the governor marveled greatly. Now, his marvel was that this man is facing crucifixion and he's not defending himself. And to know what's coming, I mean, on some level that seemed to impress Pilate. This was a man who was not going to engage in what the Jewish leadership was trying to do. And there was some respect as I read it. Okay, I mean, it didn't make sense to Pilate, but at least he could see that Jesus was a reasonable man being railroaded. And he was going to take it. Christ was going to take it. We know why. So then, to finish up this section, Luke 23, verse 5, it says, but they insisted, and that's not a very strong word there. They were adamant, because they're talking to Pilate now, and they're making veiled threats here. It says, but they insisted, saying to Pilate, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee even to this place. This man is a traitor and an insurrectionist. And if you don't deal with him, we're going to make your life problematic. Now, remember what I said. The two primary responsibilities of the governor was to keep the peace and to collect the taxes. And here they're speaking directly to his authority as governor. If this gets out of hand and there's a rebellion, your neck is on the line. So they did not have a cozy relationship, Pilate and the Jewish leadership. Pilate couldn't stand them. One of the things that he did early on that angered the Jews was that as the representation of the Roman government, like the generals, he would have what's called a standard. And on top of this standard, think of a pole. Sometimes it would have a flag on it as well. You'd oftentimes see this in battles. But on top of that was the Roman eagle, the symbol of the Caesar's power. He took that when he first came to Judea. He took that and he put it in the temple court complex, outside of the temple itself, in the inner court. Outer court. And the Jews were so angered at this blasphemy that there was a revolt. And there were many, many, many Jews that were killed. The Roman garrisons had to put down this. But Pilate, to his credit, didn't press the issue any further. He took the Roman standard out of the temple area. So he understood that you don't want that happening. And if it did happen another time and he had a black mark before the Caesar, he might not only not have a job, he might not have his life anymore. So as first priority to maintain the peace, he progresses from here, but he punts the ball first. So next time we'll pick up in Luke 23 when Pilate sends Jesus to Herod. Because if this is a local matter, Herod, as the local ruler of Jerusalem, the local king under the governor, he was hoping probably that Herod would make the decision and he would no longer be involved in this. Of course, we know that doesn't happen, but Christ is 3 times before the civil authorities. You remember a couple of Bible studies ago, we talked about the threes there. So he goes to Pilate first, he goes to Herod, and then Herod kicks it back to Pilate. So ultimately, there'll be 3 times. All right, we'll conclude there for this evening.